A church, barely lit, a handful of candles throwing long shadows across stone walls that have stood for centuries. Two figures stand before a priest, their backs to the only witnesses in the room, their faces deliberately turned away from history itself. There is no crowd here, no official announcement waiting to be printed in tomorrow's papers. No trumpets, no procession, none of the ceremony you would expect for a wedding involving someone of immense importance, just a quiet exchange of vows, conducted in near-total secrecy, in a foreign country, far from the eyes of an empire that would have stopped it in an instant if it could. Somewhere beyond these walls, a war is still years away. An empire still stands, seemingly unshakable, and almost no one outside this room has any idea what has just taken place. 11 months after this quiet ceremony, the man standing at that altar would be handed something almost no one in human history has ever offered. Not a promotion, not a modest inheritance, an actual empire, one of the largest, richest, most powerful thrones the modern world had ever produced. He would look at it and he would say no. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in the history of the last few centuries, there is a man who was handed, quite literally, one of the most powerful thrones on the planet, at the exact moment his country needed someone, anyone, to hold it together. And he turned around and refused, choosing instead the life he had already built with a woman his own family had once tried to erase from existence entirely. To understand how a man ends up refusing an empire, we first have to understand exactly what he was walking away from. And to understand that, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a boy nobody expected to matter at all. This is a true story. Somewhere in this story is a hidden prince, a man who spent his entire childhood in the shadow of a far more famous brother, so overlooked by history that most people alive today have never even heard his name. Somewhere in this story is a fortune, one of the largest private fortunes ever assembled by a single family in the history of the world. Somewhere in this story is a forbidden woman, someone this man was never, under any circumstance permitted by law or tradition, supposed to fall in love with. And somewhere in this story is a throne, a real one, handed to him in a moment of total desperation, and refused. We are not going to answer any of those questions yet. Not who he was, not who she was, not which empire we are even talking about, not how any of it ends. What we can tell you is this. This is not a story about a minor royal who quietly stepped aside from an unimportant title. This is a story about a man who stood, at one specific moment in history, closer to absolute power than almost anyone else alive on the planet at the time, and chose, deliberately, not to take it. Along the way, he will lose a fortune most of us cannot fully picture. He will be exiled from the only world he has ever known. He will fight a war most people alive today have never studied in any real depth, and he will make a decision on one single sleepless night that changes the course of the 20th century. But by the time this story is finished, an empire that had ruled for 300 years will have collapsed. And it will have collapsed, in no small part, because of a decision one man made for the sake of love. Every one of those threads is real. Every one of them is documented, in letters, in court records, in newspaper archives from 3 different countries. This isn't speculation dressed up as history. It's a story that actually happened, to a real family, inside one of the most powerful empires the modern world has ever known, and it has simply been waiting, for over a century, for someone to tell it properly. It starts here. St. Petersburg, 1878. Before you meet the boy at the center of this story, you need to understand exactly what he was born into, because without understanding the true scale of what was at stake, nothing that follows will land the way it should. The Romanov dynasty did not simply govern Russia from a comfortable distance, the way a modern head of state might. The family personally owned an empire's worth of private wealth, held entirely separate from the state treasury itself. We are talking about palaces so vast they functioned almost like small cities. The Winter Palace alone contained more than 1,000 rooms. We are talking about land holdings stretching across territory larger than entire European nations, forests and farmland, and entire towns that existed simply because the family that owned them decided they should. We are talking about vaults filled with gold reserves, and rooms upon rooms of jewels, including pieces of craftsmanship so extraordinary that some of them, like the famous jeweled eggs commissioned each year from the House of Fabergé, are still considered among the finest objects human hands have ever produced. Historians who have attempted to translate this fortune into modern terms consistently arrive at the same staggering conclusion. In today's money, we are talking about a private family fortune worth well into the billions of dollars. quite possibly one of the largest personal fortunes any single family has ever controlled, at any point in recorded history, dwarfing the combined net worth of most of the world's modern billionaires. Some estimates, accounting for land, art, jewels, and gold reserves together, place the total value of Romanov holdings at levels that would rank the family among the wealthiest private entities the world has ever seen, royal or otherwise, a scale of wealth so large that even the family itself reportedly struggled to fully account for everything it owned. To be born a Grand Duke of Russia, then, was not simply to be born wealthy. It was to be born with direct, personal access to one of the greatest private treasuries the world has ever known. Palaces like the Winter Palace in the heart of St. Petersburg, or the sprawling gardens and gilded fountains of Peterhof, or the more intimate imperial residence at Tsarskoye Selo, were not distant symbols of state power, reserved for coronations and ceremonies. For a boy born into this family, they were simply home, the ordinary backdrop of an entirely extraordinary childhood. Consider what daily life actually looked like inside this world. Armies of household staff, many of whom served the same family for their entire working lives, generation after generation. Private trains are outfitted with their own chapels, entire wings of palaces kept permanently ready for members of the family who might arrive with only a day's notice. Tutors imported from across Europe to teach languages few of the children would ever need outside the walls of the court itself. Jewel collections so vast that many pieces were catalogued once and then simply never worn again, locked away in vaults alongside crowns, scepters, and ceremonial regalia dating back hundreds of years. This was not simply the life of a wealthy family. This was a level of private wealth that, even by the standards of history's most famous fortunes, stood almost entirely alone. This was the inheritance one particular boy was born into. It would take him nearly his entire life to walk away from it, and even longer for the rest of the world to understand exactly why he did. And there's a reason you've likely never heard his name before today. The final Romanovs who died at Yekaterinburg became instant, permanent symbols of the revolution, their story retold in countless books, films, and documentaries over the past century. Michael's story, by contrast, ended quietly, in a forest most people have never heard of, with no surviving grave and no dramatic final photograph. History remembers spectacle. It tends to forget the quiet, deliberate choices that happen just outside the frame. This is one of those choices, finally brought back into the light. He was named Michael Alexandrovich, the third son of Tsar Alexander III, and from the moment he was born, almost no one expected very much of him at all. His eldest brother, Nicholas, was destined for the throne from birth, the undisputed center of the family's attention, the boy groomed from infancy to one day rule the largest empire on earth, tutored separately, held to an entirely different standard, and spoken of by household staff in tones reserved specifically for a future sovereign. His second brother, George, stood directly behind Nicholas in the line of succession and was treated in turn as a kind of insurance policy, someone whose health and education mattered enormously in case anything should ever happen to Nicholas. Michael, born third, occupied a strange and largely overlooked position within his own family. Important enough to matter, in theory, should the unthinkable happen to his brothers. Unimportant enough, in daily practice, that almost no one paid him very much attention at all. Michael was not an only child. Beyond his brothers Nicholas and George, he had two younger sisters, Xenia and Olga, both of whom would go on to lead lives shaped by the same rigid expectations that governed his own childhood, and both of whom, in different ways, would later show their own quiet independence from the roles the court had assigned them. It was, in many ways, a family full of people gradually pulling against the same invisible walls, even if Michael's pull would end up being the one that mattered most to history. His father, Alexander III, had come to the throne under the shadow of his own father's assassination. Michael's grandfather, Alexander II, had been killed by a bomb thrown on a St. Petersburg street. That trauma shaped everything about how Michael and his siblings were raised. The family lived largely behind the fortified walls of Gatchina Palace, ringed by guards, more a heavily secured compound than a home in any conventional sense. Life inside that court was gilded in every visible way, and suffocating in nearly every way that actually mattered. Days began early and followed a rigid, unchanging schedule of lessons in language, military theory, religious instruction, and the countless small rituals of court etiquette a Grand Duke was expected to master before he could even properly read. Endless etiquette governed every interaction, down to the smallest gesture. Military duty began early and never really ended. religious obligations structured entire days, and personal freedom, in any meaningful sense, was almost entirely absent. Every hour accounted for, every companion carefully vetted, every unsupervised moment treated by the household staff as a small failure of security. If you look closely at formal portraits of the family from this period, you will notice something quietly telling. Michael is almost always positioned just slightly apart from his older brothers, present included, but somehow peripheral, even within his own family. By most accounts that survive from people who actually knew him, Michael was warm, easy to like, even genuinely charming in private settings, with a playful streak his more serious brother never really displayed. Tutors and family friends who wrote about him later described a boy who preferred the company of soldiers and grooms in the palace stables to the formal receptions his older brother was groomed to host. He loved horses, he loved the outdoors. He seemed, by every account, far more comfortable in a saddle than in a throne room, but inside a court obsessed with rank and destiny, warmth was not a quality anyone particularly valued. He was chronically underestimated, the spare to the spare. A boy the family simply assumed would never really matter, and who was, in many quiet ways, left to grow up largely on his own terms, precisely because no one thought it mattered very much what kind of man he became. And then, without warning, tragedy reshaped the entire trajectory of his life. His brother George, second in line to the throne, died young of tuberculosis, having spent much of his short adult life in poor health in the mountains of Georgia, far from the court that had little use for an heir it assumed would never actually rule. It devastated the family. And it created a consequence nobody had planned for or particularly wanted. Michael, the boy no one had ever expected to matter, suddenly found himself standing one step closer to an empire. The boy the court had spent years underestimating was quietly growing into a man they would come to underestimate even more. As a young man, Michael entered military service, eventually rising to command a cavalry regiment. By nearly every account from the men who served under him, he was genuinely capable, respected, competent, taken seriously as a leader, in a way the court itself rarely extended to him. But he also carried a reputation that unsettled the older, more traditional officers around him. He was informal with the men serving under his command, in ways that scandalized the old guard, laughing easily with enlisted soldiers, treating rigid military hierarchy with noticeably less reverence than tradition demanded of a Grand Duke. There was a restlessness in him that people close to the family often remarked on. He had, by this point, already developed a fascination with the automobile, still a novelty at the time, and considered faintly undignified for a man of his rank, and was known to drive far too fast along the roads outside St. Petersburg, much to the horror of his security detail. It was a small detail, but a telling one. Even in the smallest choices available to him, Michael seemed drawn toward whatever the court considered improper. That restlessness had already led him into trouble once before. Years earlier, Michael had fallen for a woman named Alexandra Kosikovskaya, a lady-in-waiting to his own sister, a match the family considered entirely unsuitable given her lack of royal blood. The Tsar had intervened directly, forbidding the match outright, and the relationship was ended before it could go any further, leaving Michael with a first-hand, painful understanding of exactly how little control he actually had over his own life, despite everything he had been born into. By the time that earlier heartbreak had faded, Michael had thrown himself further into his military career, eventually taking command of a full cavalry regiment with genuine seriousness, even as the broader court continued to view him as something of an afterthought. He earned a reputation among his fellow officers as fair-minded and unusually approachable for a man of his rank, the kind of commanding officer soldiers spoke well of long after their service ended. Historical accounts suggest this wasn't the first time Michael had been drawn toward relationships the court considered inappropriate. It was simply about to become, by an enormous margin, the most consequential. Around this period, Michael found himself posted with an elite cavalry unit known as the Blue Cuirassiers. Serving directly under his command was an officer named Vladimir Wolfert. That officer happened to be married. And his wife was about to change the entire course of Russian history. Her name was Natalia Sheremetevskaya, a lawyer's daughter, sharp, talented, and fiercely independent, raised in a professional Moscow household far removed from the aristocracy. Long before Michael entered her life, Natalia had already built a reputation that made her, in the eyes of Imperial Russian high society, almost radioactively unsuitable for anyone connected to the royal family. She had married young, to a man named Sergei Mamontov, and that marriage had ended in divorce before she married Wolfert. To understand why that single detail carried so much weight, you have to understand exactly how rigid the social codes of this world actually were. In Imperial Russia, a woman who had already been divorced, let alone divorced and then remarried, occupied a social position the aristocracy treated as almost untouchable, regardless of her intelligence, her character, or her personal accomplishments. Add royal blood into the equation, on the other side of the relationship, and the gap between them was not simply wide. Under the actual laws of the empire, it was supposed to be impossible to cross at all. But Natalia was never a passive figure, waiting on the sidelines for circumstance to define her. By every surviving account, she was strikingly attractive, quick-witted, and genuinely magnetic, a woman who had learned, entirely on her own terms, how to navigate a deeply rigid and unforgiving society. She managed her own affairs. She held her ground in rooms full of people who looked down on her without hesitation. She dressed with a sense of style that contemporaries noted stood out even among aristocratic women who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of self-presentation. And she carried herself with a quiet confidence that unsettled people who expected a divorced commoner to shrink from attention rather than command it. It's worth pausing here to notice something the rest of this story will make clear. Natalia was never simply the passive object of a prince's affection, a role so many royal love stories flatten women into. She was a fully formed adult with her own history, her own resilience, and her own hard-won independence, built entirely without the safety net of rank or inherited wealth. Everything she had built herself, and she had absolutely no idea that a single evening spent among her husband's fellow officers was about to place her directly at the center of an empire's entire succession crisis. Michael and Natalia met through her husband's regiment, likely at one of the formal regimental gatherings officers were expected to attend with their wives, and something between them formed almost immediately, with an intensity neither of them seemed able, or willing, to resist. Those who observed them together in those early months described an unmistakable chemistry. Michael, normally reserved in formal settings, visibly relaxing and coming alive in her presence, in a way his fellow officers had rarely seen from him. What followed was reckless by any measure available to them at the time, an affair that began while Natalia was still legally married to an officer serving directly beneath Michael's own command. Secret meetings, carefully arranged in private homes and quiet corners of the city, sometimes disguised as chance encounters at the theater or at the homes of mutual friends willing to look the other way. Letters written in coded, careful language designed to survive interception without revealing what they truly meant to anyone who wasn't already in on the secret. Endearments folded into ordinary sentences, references to people and places that meant nothing to an outsider, but carried entire private conversations between the two of them. A relationship that deepened steadily, month after month, even as both of them understood, with total clarity, exactly how dangerous it had already become, and even as the possibility of simply walking away from each other became less and less realistic with every passing week. On at least one occasion, according to later accounts, the two of them narrowly avoided being discovered together by a member of the extended court traveling through the same city, a close call that should have served as a warning to end things immediately, and instead seemed only to deepen their resolve to find a way to make the relationship permanent, rather than something that had to be hidden in corners and side doors for the rest of their lives. It didn't take long for word of the affair to reach the palace, and the Tsar had one rule that could never, under any circumstances, be broken. That rule was written directly into something called the Pauline Laws, the formal legal code, dating back over a century, that governed exactly who a Grand Duke of Russia was permitted to marry. Marry without the Tsar's explicit consent, and the consequences were not symbolic gestures or private disappointments. You would forfeit your rank, your income, your place in the line of succession, all of it, at once, with no realistic path back. Nicholas II and the formidable Dowager Empress, Maria Fyodorovna, confronted Michael directly, warning him in the clearest possible terms that this relationship needed to end, immediately and completely. Family letters from the period, some of which survive in Russian archives to this day, reveal a mother torn between genuine affection for her son and absolute horror at what he seemed prepared to risk. She reminded him, in writing, of everything their family had endured to protect the dignity of the crown, and of everything he stood to throw away over a woman she refused even to name directly in her correspondence. From that point forward, Michael found himself quietly, carefully watched, his personal correspondence monitored, his movements tracked by people loyal first and only to the crown. Agents were assigned, discreetly, to report on where he went and who he met. It was, in its own way, a strange mirror of the isolation he'd felt as a child, watched constantly, trusted rarely, except now the watching had a clear and explicit purpose, to make absolutely certain he did not do exactly what he was already planning to do. He had been told, in explicit and unmistakable terms, exactly what he stood to lose. And rather than retreat, something inside him hardened into resolve. In 1910, while still legally forbidden from marrying her, Natalia gave birth to their son, a boy they named George, born quietly abroad, far from the scrutiny of the Russian court. A child born into a family that, by law, did not yet officially recognize his parents' relationship at all. Instead of backing away from any of it, Michael began quietly assembling a plan that would finally make things right, whatever the cost. Michael and Natalia arranged, in careful and deliberate secrecy, to leave Russia altogether, settling on Vienna as the site for a ceremony that would take place entirely outside the reach of imperial oversight. Every detail had to be managed with real precision. False pretenses were arranged to justify the travel, discreet witnesses were quietly lined up in advance, luggage was kept minimal, deliberately unremarkable, so as not to draw the wrong kind of attention at the wrong moment, from the wrong set of eyes. There is a particular, unmistakable tension that comes with a departure like this one, the tension of a genuine point of no return, boarding a train in the hushed, uncertain hours before dawn in St. Petersburg. Uncertain whether you will ever be permitted to return home again, one last glance back at a platform that represents everything familiar, everything safe, everything you are choosing, deliberately, to leave behind you. The journey itself took them across the Russian border into Austria-Hungary, through cities where neither of them held any official standing at all, where Michael was, for the first time in his entire life, simply a private citizen, traveling with the woman he loved, rather than a grand duke trailed by protocol and expectation. Hotel registers from the route, where they survive, show the two of them traveling under quietly altered names, a small but telling detail. A Grand Duke of Russia, reduced to signing a false name in a guest ledger simply to marry the person he loved without interference. It must have felt, even amid the anxiety of what they were about to do, like a strange and unfamiliar kind of freedom. By morning, they would be married, and by the time the Tsar found out what had happened, it would already be far too late for anyone to stop it. On October 16th, 1912, inside a small Serbian Orthodox church in Vienna, Michael Alexandrovich and Natalia Sheremetevskaya were married in a ceremony built, quite deliberately, to exist almost invisibly. There was no formal announcement anywhere. No public record beyond the bare minimum the law required, just a handful of trusted witnesses, a priest willing to perform the ceremony without asking too many questions, and two people choosing each other with complete, unflinching awareness of exactly what that choice was going to cost them both. There is something quietly extraordinary about a wedding constructed entirely around secrecy like this, two people choosing love not in spite of an audience, but in the deliberate, total absence of one. No applause, no blessing from a family that should, by every tradition, have been standing beside them. Just candlelight, and vows, and each other, and a 2-year-old son waiting for them somewhere far away. Picture the scale of what they were doing measured against everything either of them had ever known. Michael had grown up attending weddings that shut down entire boulevards of St. Petersburg, ceremonies with foreign dignitaries and cathedral bells ringing across the city. Here, instead, was a small stone church in a foreign capital, a handful of trusted faces, and a priest speaking the liturgy in hushed, careful tones, aware that discovery could end his own career as easily as it could end theirs. And yet by every account that survives, neither Michael nor Natalia showed the slightest hesitation as the ceremony proceeded. Whatever fear either of them carried into that church, it apparently gave way, in that moment, to something steadier. But even as they stood together inside that quiet church, a telegram reporting the marriage was already being drafted back home, already making its way toward St. Petersburg and directly toward the Tsar. The reaction, when it finally landed, was immediate and severe. According to accounts from within the court, Nicholas II read the news in disbelief before it curdled into genuine fury and a deep, personal sense of betrayal, not only that his brother had defied him, but that he had done so in secret, presenting the family with an irreversible fact rather than a request Nicholas might have had the chance to refuse in person. Advisors moved quickly. Within days, the machinery of the state was already drafting the formal punishment. Michael was stripped of his regency status almost instantly and formally banned from ever returning to Russian soil. And then came the consequence that mattered most of all, the one that turned an abstract idea into something devastatingly concrete. Michael's personal fortune, his palaces, his estates, his direct access to one of the largest private wealth holdings the world has ever recorded, was placed under states-appointed guardianship. Every property, every account, every piece of that inheritance now required official approval before Michael could touch it at all. For the first time in this story, the billion-dollar inheritance we opened with was no longer a distant idea. It had become, in a very literal and legal sense, something taken entirely out of his hands. The Dowager Empress refused, flatly, to receive Natalia at court. Russian high society reacted with open scandal, whispered speculation rippling through every drawing room in the capital about what this meant for the line of succession itself, because Michael, remember, had been standing next in line to inherit the entire throne. Extended Romanov relatives, cousins and aunts who had known Michael his entire life, largely fell in line behind the Tsar's judgment, some out of genuine disapproval, others simply out of fear of drawing similar wrath onto themselves. Letters from this period show a family closing ranks, treating Michael less like an errant relative to be gently corrected, and more like a cautionary tale to be quietly discussed and never repeated. Newspapers across Europe, always hungry for royal scandal, picked up fragments of the story despite the Russian court's best efforts at containment. The practical effects of the guardianship were immediate and humbling. Income that had once simply appeared, drawn from vast estates Michael had never needed to think twice about, now had to be formally requested and approved by officials answering directly to the Tsar. Properties he had grown up considering as much a part of himself as his own name were, from that point forward, managed by people he had no say in choosing. Household expenses that had once been handled invisibly by an army of stewards now required paperwork, approval, and patience from a man who had never in his life had to wait for money he considered his own. For a man born into one of the largest fortunes in the world, it was a strange and disorienting introduction to something most people learn far earlier in life, the experience of not having enough. Michael believed, at that moment, that he had already given up everything for the sake of love. He had absolutely no idea what waiting for him in England would actually look like, or how much he would have to rebuild, entirely from nothing, in order to construct an actual life there. Michael and Natalia settled at Nebworth, in the quiet English countryside, living far more modestly than his royal birth would ever have suggested was possible. And by nearly every contemporary account that survives from this period, these years were among the happiest of Michael's entire life. For what may have been the very first time, Michael experienced something he had never once been permitted as a child, growing up inside the Russian Imperial court: ordinary, unremarkable domesticity. Reading quietly beside a fire in the evenings with Natalia and their young son nearby. Walking the grounds of a modest estate without an entourage trailing behind him. Indulging, finally without judgment, his old fascination with motorcars. Driving the English countryside roads at speeds that would have scandalized the palace back home. A life defined not by ceremony, obligation, and constant observation, but by simple, unguarded happiness with the one family he had chosen for himself. Michael eventually granted Natalia the formal title Countess Brasova, a small but genuinely meaningful gesture of legitimacy, even though the Russian court back home still refused, categorically, to recognize her as anything at all. Together, quietly and deliberately, the two of them built an entirely new identity outside the rigid, punishing system that had defined every single hour of Michael's life up to that point. Their household at Knebworth, by the accounts of English acquaintances who visited during these years, felt almost defiantly ordinary. Guests remembered long dinners with easy conversation, none of the rigid formality that would have governed an equivalent evening back in St. Petersburg. Michael took up hunting on the estate grounds and continued indulging his love of fast cars, occasionally alarming the locals with his driving. He corresponded with English friends about horses and motoring with the enthusiasm of a man who had never expected to have the time for such ordinary pleasures. Natalia, for her part, seemed to relish the relative anonymity of English country life, free from the constant scrutiny that had followed her every move back home, spending her days managing the household and raising their young son largely outside the public eye that had defined so much of her earlier life. For two people who had given up so much to be together, it was, by every indication, a genuinely happy chapter, quiet in a way neither of them had ever been allowed to experience before. That peace lasted less than 2 years. In the summer of 1914, the world went to war, and Michael was about to be called back to the very empire that had cast him out so completely. Despite everything that had happened, the exile, the stripped title, the seized fortune, the years spent as an outcast from his own family, Michael returned to Russia the moment war broke out, in order to serve. He was given command of what became known as the Savage Division, an elite unit made up of volunteer cavalry drawn from the mountain peoples of the Caucasus, men considered by the regular army to be almost impossible to properly command. And by multiple surviving accounts, Michael served with genuine distinction and real tangible courage under fire, leading his division through some of the fiercest fighting on the Eastern Front, and eventually earning Russia's highest military honor for personal bravery, the Cross of St. George. The division he commanded fought in some of the most brutal terrain of the entire Eastern Front, across the Carpathian Mountains, and through the offensives that came to define Russia's war against Austria-Hungary. Soldiers who served under him described a commander who insisted on sharing the same hardships as his men, refusing privileges his rank would ordinarily have guaranteed him without question. During one especially fierce engagement, Michael reportedly rode forward alongside his men, rather than directing the assault safely from behind the lines, an act that earned him genuine respect from soldiers who had every reason to distrust an aristocrat, parachuted into command. It was, in its own strange way, the same instinct that had scandalized the old guard back in his younger years as a cavalry officer, an unwillingness to simply accept the separation his birth was supposed to demand between himself and everyone around him. Wartime necessity accomplished something the Tsar's original fury never could. It softened, at least somewhat, the court's official stance toward him. Michael's marriage was grudgingly tolerated, and Natalia was, for the first time, permitted a more visible role in Russian society, even as the deeper wounds between Michael and the rest of his family never fully healed. This chapter of Michael's life matters enormously, because it reframes him one final time before everything in this story changes irreversibly. He was not simply a romantic figure who had defied his family for the sake of love. He was, when it truly mattered, a man capable of genuine leadership and real physical courage, precisely the qualities the court had spent his entire life quietly insisting he simply did not possess. Qualities that made his eventual refusal of the throne all the more striking, because by every measure that should have counted, he was, by 1917, more than capable of the job. While Michael was busy proving himself on the battlefield, the empire he had been born into was quietly collapsing behind him. By February of 1917, mass unrest, coordinated strikes, and open mutiny were sweeping through St. Petersburg, by then renamed Petrograd. Bread shortages had emptied shelves across the capital. 3 years of catastrophic wartime losses had drained the country of both resources and morale, and resentment toward a monarchy many Russians increasingly viewed as out of touch with their suffering had reached a breaking point. Soldiers garrisoned in the city, exhausted by years of horrific casualties at the front, began refusing orders to fire on their own protesting countrymen, and in some cases turned their weapons on their own officers instead. Tsar Nicholas II, increasingly isolated from his own government and his own military, was confronted directly by his generals and closest advisors with a truth none of them wanted to say out loud. The monarchy, as it had existed continuously for 300 years, could not realistically survive in its current form. Telegrams reached him from every corner of military command, each one delivering some version of the same unbearable message. The army could no longer guarantee his authority, and further resistance risked plunging the country into an even more violent chaos. The collapse, when it finally came, happened with astonishing, almost disorienting speed. An empire that had stood unbroken for centuries unraveled in a matter of days. Stranded aboard his own train, physically unable even to reach the capital in time, surrounded by generals who no longer fully trusted him, and a rail network increasingly controlled by revolutionary committees rather than the crown, Nicholas made the decision to abdicate the throne entirely. But he did not abdicate in favor of his own son, the young and hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei, whose fragile health made the idea of installing him as a wartime emperor untenable. Instead, Nicholas abdicated in favor of the very brother he had once cast out of Russia completely. Michael received word, almost impossibly, that he was now, officially, the presumptive emperor of all of Russia. What followed was an anguished, sleepless, overnight deliberation inside a private apartment in Petrograd. Members of the new provisional government, including the politician Alexander Kerensky and the Duma's chairman Mikhail Rodzianko, gathered around him through the long night, arguing back and forth, weighing an empire already in total collapse against a capital where armed revolutionary crowds now controlled the streets outside. Kerensky, by most surviving accounts, was blunt with him, warning that he could not guarantee Michael's safety for even a single day if he accepted the crown, and that the soldiers who had just overthrown one Romanov were unlikely to quietly accept another. Other voices in the room urged him the opposite way, insisting that only a sitting monarch could hold the fracturing army together against Germany. Michael listened carefully to all of it. He asked pointed, difficult questions about troop loyalty, about the mood in the streets, about whether anyone in that room could honestly promise him the throne would still exist in a month's time. No one could. Outside the windows of the apartment where the discussion unfolded, the sound of the city itself seemed to answer the question before Michael did. Distant crowds, sporadic gunfire, the unmistakable noise of a capital that no longer recognized the authority of the family Michael had been born into. And as dawn finally broke over the city, pale winter light spilling into a room full of exhausted men who had spent the entire night arguing over the fate of an empire, he arrived at his decision. On March 3, 1917, Michael issued a formal manifesto declining to accept the throne outright. The document, carefully worded by lawyers and advisors gathered around him through the night, stated that he would only assume supreme power if that were the express will of the Russian people, expressed through a future, freely elected constituent assembly, and only once order and calm had been fully restored to the country. Until such time, he authority of the provisional government. It was a masterfully diplomatic piece of writing, crafted in a matter of hours by exhausted lawyers under conditions no legal document should ever have to be written in, and everyone standing in that room, including Michael himself, almost certainly understood in that moment that such an assembly, and such an offer, would never actually come. In effect, without ever explicitly abdicating a throne he had never formally held, Michael had quietly closed the door on 3 centuries of dynastic rule. With that single decision, made over the course of a single sleepless night, more than 300 years of continuous Romanov rule came to an end. History would echo this same basic story again, decades later, in a very different country, when another royal figure would famously give up a throne for the person he loved. That later story became one of the most famous romantic tales of the 20th century, retold endlessly in books and films and documentaries much like this one. But Michael's decision came first, carried immeasurably higher stakes, and unfolded amid a revolution rather than a peaceful transition of power, and unlike that later, more famous story, almost no one alive today has ever heard his name. He had already given up an unimaginable fortune for the sake of love. He had just given up an entire empire too. He had absolutely no idea that he had only 15 months left to live. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, Michael attempted, quietly and carefully, to build a private life with Natalia and their young son at their estate outside Gatchina, the very same fortified palace grounds where he had spent so much of his own childhood. There is a particular kind of quiet sorrow in that image, a man once destined for the throne, returning to the walls he grew up behind, trying now simply to live an ordinary life within them, watched by a government that no longer recognized any of the old rules his family had once lived by. But the newly formed Bolshevik government, having seized power from the provisional government by the end of 1917, kept him under constant, close observation, reporting requirements, ongoing surveillance, a slow and deliberate tightening of what little freedom remained available to him. Local revolutionary committees required him to check in regularly, treating a man who had once been offered an empire as little more than a suspicious private citizen requiring monitoring. In early 1918, fearful that Michael's mere existence made him a potential rallying point for anti-Bolshevik forces gathering in the east, the new government ordered him formally exiled internally to the city of Perm, deep in the Ural Mountains, separated once again from Natalia, who was refused permission to accompany him. In Perm, Michael lived under a form of loose but constant surveillance, permitted to move about the city, to take meals in local hotels, even to make occasional acquaintances among the townspeople, all while local Bolshevik officials debated, with increasing urgency, exactly what to do with a man whose name alone still carried enough weight to worry them. He wrote letters regularly to Natalia, careful and affectionate, describing the mundane details of a life reduced to hotel rooms and government check-ins, letters that gave no hint he understood just how limited his remaining time actually was, updates about the weather, small jokes, reassurances that he was being treated well, the ordinary language of a husband trying to keep his wife from worrying, written by a man who had no way of knowing those small reassurances would be some of the last words she ever received from him. Local acquaintances later described him as courteous and unfailingly calm, a man who, even stripped of nearly everything, still carried himself with a quiet, unassuming dignity that seemed to unsettle the officials assigned to watch him. The dread of this final chapter builds not through dramatic confrontation, but through something far quieter, and in some ways far more chilling, permission forms that took longer to approve, letters that arrived less and less frequently, a final farewell exchanged on a train platform, understated almost to the point of silence, neither of them willing to say out loud the fear they clearly both felt. On the night of June the 12th, 1918, a knock finally came at his hotel room door in Perm for the last time. Michael was taken from his room under the false pretense of a routine transfer, along with his personal secretary, an Englishman named Nicholas Johnson who had remained loyal to him, and who, by every account, could easily have left Russia safely months earlier, and chose not to. Local Bolshevik agents drove the two men into a birch forest just outside the city and executed them there, in secret, without trial, without any formal charge, without so much as a public announcement of what had happened. His body was never recovered, and to this day, its final resting place remains unknown, one of the enduring mysteries in a story already defined by disappearances and secrets. The official version, put out by local authorities at the time, claimed Michael had simply escaped custody, a story almost no one who knew the circumstances actually believed, but one that persisted in official records for years, muddying the truth and delaying any real accounting of what had actually happened that night. It would take years for any credible account of what had truly happened that night in the forest to reach the outside world at all, pieced together slowly from fragments, rumors, and the eventual testimony of people involved who could no longer stay silent. He became one of the very first members of the extended Romanov family to be killed, months before the rest of his relatives, including his brother Nicholas, and Nicholas's own wife and 5 children, met a similarly brutal fate at Yekaterinburg. In a strange and tragic irony, the brother who had once cast Michael out of Russia entirely for the crime of marrying the woman he loved would follow him into death only weeks later, the two of them united, in the end, by the same revolution that had once seemed to divide them so completely. In France, Natalia would not learn the full, certain truth of what had happened to him for years afterward. He never lived to see how history would eventually remember him, but someone else lived long enough to make absolutely certain his story would never be forgotten. Natalia survived. She managed to flee revolutionary Russia and eventually settled in Paris, living out the remainder of her life there in quiet, often financially difficult exile, far removed from the wealth she had once briefly touched by marriage. Reports from those years describe a woman who spoke rarely, and only reluctantly, about the life she had once lived, carrying her grief with a kind of quiet dignity rather than public mourning. She never remarried. She died in Paris in 1952, outliving Michael by more than 3 full decades, having spent every one of those years as the last living witness to exactly what their choice had actually cost them both. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. A woman who had once been at the center of an empire's succession crisis, married to a man who was, for a single fleeting day, the presumptive emperor of Russia, spent the final decades of her life in modest rooms in a foreign city, far from any palace, with nothing left of that world except her memories and the son they had raised together. That son, George, the boy born quietly abroad in 1910 before his parents were even legally permitted to marry, grew up in exile alongside his mother, carrying the Brasov name rather than the Romanov title that, under different circumstances, might have been his by birth. Tragedy would find him too. In 1931, at only 20 years old, George was killed in a car accident on a road outside Paris, a devastating loss that came for Natalia only a year before her own health began to fail permanently. By the time she died 2 decades later, she had outlived not only her husband, but the child who had been the last living piece of the life they had built together. So why, after everything, does this particular story still matter so much today? Because a man the court had spent his entire life dismissing as nothing more than the spare, a man who was, at one single moment in a chaotic Petrograd night, handed the closest thing to unlimited wealth and, ultimately, absolute power over an entire empire, chose love and personal conscience instead. Not once, but twice. And he paid for both of those choices with everything he had, including, in the end, his own life. This was never simply a royal romance tucked away in the footnotes of history. It was a genuine hinge point in the story of the modern world, turned entirely by one man's quiet refusal to accept what he had been handed. Historians still debate what might have happened had Michael accepted the crown that night in March. Some argue nothing could have saved the monarchy at that point, regardless of who wore the crown. Others believe a legitimate, popular Tsar willing to work with a constitutional government might have changed the entire trajectory of the revolution that followed, and with it, the trajectory of the 20th century itself. We will never know for certain, but he didn't accept it. And the world we live in today was shaped, in some small but undeniable way, by that refusal, made by a man the palace had spent his entire life dismissing as the one who would never really matter. What we can say with certainty is this: Michael was never handed a single easy choice in his entire adult life. Every decision he made, the marriage, the war, the crown, cost him something enormous, and he made each one anyway, with his eyes open, fully aware of the price attached. That, more than any inheritance or any title, may be the truest measure of who he actually was. Not a man defined by what he was born into, but by what he was repeatedly willing to walk away from. He was offered an empire. He chose love instead. Twice. In the end, the man that history had almost completely forgotten became the man who ultimately decided how it would all end, not with a crown, but with a single, deliberate choice. Michael never got to see how his story would be remembered. He never knew that, more than a century later, people around the world would still be discovering his name for the very first time, still be moved by a decision he made, in the space of a single, desperate night. But maybe the real question at the heart of all this isn't really about him at all. Maybe it's about the rest of us, and what we would actually do if the choice were ever placed in front of us the way it was placed in front of him. If you had to choose, right now, between unlimited wealth and power on one hand, or the one person you truly loved on the other, what would you choose? Would you have made the same decision Michael did, knowing everything it would eventually cost him? Or would you have taken the throne, told yourself you could hold on to both, and hoped history would prove you right? I would genuinely love to hear your answer. Tell me in the comments below. And if this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while researching it, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories exactly like this one. If you love hidden history, royal secrets, and true stories that somehow feel stranger than fiction, go ahead and subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from, stories about the people history nearly forgot, told the way they deserve to be told. And if you think giving up an entire empire for love sounds unbelievable, just wait until you hear about the queen who faked her own death to escape her crown entirely. That story is coming next.